So okay, let me ask you a question. Before we're just pre-rolling anyway.
Yeah.
So those AI like pins or those tools, because you mentioned the reason I brought that jogged my memory on those, which I think we can all say are for the most part completely flopped, failed devices at least.
Well, I was going to say I thought that they'd utterly flopped, but now I'm getting adverts again.
Oh, interesting.
Them. Yeah.
Last desperate gasp of investors trying to get their money back.
Maybe.
Anyway, but when you have those conversations, there is this moment of like, oh, that would be nice to have something capturing those moments, those serendipitous moments where you're like, dang, that was amazing that I said that. Or somebody else said it, but I can't remember it. But like, my skin crawls thinking about having that quantified.
Right. Plus the fact, who has the time to go back? It's like these people that wear a GoPro all the time. I mean, when do they ever go back and look at their footage?
And we know this from decades of vacation photos and slides and all the people walking around a tourist trap with their video camera. And I'm like, who's actually going back? I mean, it's nice to...
Well, it's all training data these days.
It is. Well, that's the thing, right? It's like, we're not going to go back and look at it, but
the AI
is going to do it. And they're going to get all kinds of data and information.
We're just going to get a whole generation of AIs trained on really bad vacation photos.
That's okay though. Better than them than us.
Right.
I suppose.
Initializing waveform.
Modulating signals for transmission.
Exploring the possible, probable, and preferable futures.
Welcome to Modem Futura. Well, what do you say? We should kick this episode off, I think.
We absolutely should.
I think we already have. Yep. But anyways, yes, so this is Modem Futura. So, welcome, Andrew.
Welcome, Sean.
Yeah, this is exciting. I think I was thinking about, again, when we were starting this podcast episode off, I'm like, okay, episode 1. How do we start this? How do we start this tale?
How are we going to start with a bang so everybody is desperate to carry on listening?
That's right. Well, if they've stuck around this far, I think we're in good shape. We're in good shape. But so I there's so much that we cover. There's so much that's happening in this space, which is equal parts terribly exciting, but also I was like, we can't. There's no way to set this up in a way where we kind of ease into it. So we just need to just jump in. And so I think, as we think about Modem Futura, right, this is a production coming out of the Future of Being Human initiative at Arizona State University, where Andrew and I are faculty. But really thinking about like the purpose of the show, right, is not only sort of highlighting and bringing into the public a lot of the work that we do, that our colleagues are doing, but also really genuinely engaging with this idea of exploring. I'm going to rip off some of Wendell Bell's quotes here about the purpose of future studies, and we're going to repurpose it to Modem Futura, is that we're really around exploring and examining and proposing, and maybe we can even invent some of these things, possible, probable, and preferable futures.
Right. And I would actually go one step further than that and say it's about using that to enable people not only to imagine those futures, but also imagine pathways between where they are at the moment and those futures so that they can actually be part of co-creating what comes after today and tomorrow.
That's it. And I think, because, you just hit on a question that I hadn't even thought about bringing up today, but I think there's this really deep, rich question around who owns the future. Mm-hmm. Right. And we'll save that for maybe another one, because that's a lot. That's a deep,
we the people own the
that's a deep dive.
Right.
But I think part of that narrative is why we are doing this. And also because of that importance for people, not just people who identify as scholars or futurists or researchers, but it's everyone has a role to play.
That's exactly it. And actually, so this is, I don't know whether we'll get into this, but why sometimes people talk about futures plural rather than the future, because each of us individually has got a different future. And the question is, how do we sort of marry those individual futures with the bigger future that we're creating together?
Yeah, absolutely. That's the, to foreshadow for future episodes too, I think we'll spend some time really digging into future studies in terms of what it is and how do we and things that we can apply from it in our everyday lives even. But that's when I give talks or anytime there's like the intentionality of the plurality of the word future,
right? With
that intent, right? That the future itself is unknowable, but we all have a capability to shape what it is and what do we want? What do we want to stay away from?
Right.
And then thinking critically and strategically at times about how do we get there? How do we stay away from there? If,
right.
we as someone who has written books and has engaged, countless years worth of investigating sci-fi movies and all that kind of stuff in the relation to how we think about the futures, it's easy to go to the dystopian route.
Right. We're going to talk about this a lot, I suspect, over future episodes, but I'm somewhat ambivalent about this idea of dystopias and how bad they are. I actually think that they've got a really important place. But yes, there are so many conversations about sort of utopias or dystopias or now protopias, somewhere in between.
Yeah, that's true.
Yep.
So let's set the stage a little bit for people, especially for new listeners who don't know us, don't know Future of Being Human. If you would indulge me, give me the quick version of, I'm going to put you on the spot, even though I have the laptop here that has everything.
We should be clear. I've got nothing in front of me, so I'm going to be making this up. Totally.
I have the world in front of I have the world at my fingertips. Andrew has nothing in front of him. What is the Future of Being Human initiative?
Yeah. So it actually has its origins very selfishly in me being desperate for catalytic conversations with people about how they see the world, how they imagine the future, and some of the really weird, exciting, incredible, and sometimes disturbing things that are happening. So I was desperate for that, but actually there's a bigger purpose to this. And that is we find increasingly that the only way we can begin to imagine futures and the ways in which we can sort of move towards the futures that we want or futures that we aspire to is to have that freedom and flexibility to explore ideas together and to be stimulated and amazed by completely left of field ideas. So the Future of Being Human initiative was primarily set up to get people together with very different ideas, very different perspectives and thoughts, and riff off each other as we begin to generate new thinking and new ideas. Little more than that. And I've got to say, so this is a really bold move in an academic institution where everything is about outputs. Yeah. And the question is, how much money have you got for grants? How many papers are you producing? Especially how many papers that nobody is ever going to read are you producing? And
behind a paywall.
Behind a paywall. And I hate that because I feel that as academics in a public university, we should be serving the public.
Yep.
And we should be having conversations and sparking ideas. And to use a term that isn't really in favor these days, we should be empowering people to understand how they can be part of creating the futures they aspire to. And these conversations are about that. They're not about actually producing stuff, but they're about catalyzing ideas and ways of seeing the world that are going to be transformative.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I think one thing that's, again, going back to some of the roots of the Future of Being Human, or as I'm trying to coin the short, the FBHI, right? Doesn't that sound cool? I don't know. We'll see if it catches on.
Yes.
But also thinking that, this is not we follow what other people are doing type of thing. This is bringing, again, that unique, diverse experience and perspectives, and really looking for what are the ways that we can catalyze new thinking. And that's one of the things I think that's so exciting about the work that we're doing, but also it gives this podcast an opportunity to be that mass communication element to bringing that into the public sphere.
I think that's exactly it. And we should say something about that focus on the individual human rather than humanity, because of course you have lots of conversations about the future of humanity writ large. But to most people, that's too abstract. Most people are really excited and motivated by the question of what does this mean for them? What does it mean for their kids? What does it mean for their friends and family and those around them? But it also allows us to open up questions around what does it truly mean to be human? If we're thinking about building a future, what is of such importance in that future that we want to desperately either keep hold of it or build it? What is it that what is it that fundamentally makes us who we are? Because when you understand that, when you understand what's really, really important to us, you can ask, how do you maintain and grow that in a world that is changing so rapidly with advanced technologies and everything else that's going on?
Yeah, and I think that's incredibly important because, I mean, we hear about these things all the time. Like right now, even in the most dominant sort of public sphere right now, the AI conversations, you can't escape that. But also things that are happening in medicine, in science, right? That these, and oftentimes if I even pause bringing in this term, the fourth industrial revolution, because it has such rigid.
Because it's so passe, we're getting towards the fifth industrial.
I know
we're
it,
not,
right? Well, it's funny. Someone once asked, well, how do we know when we're there? I'm like, well, technically the nice thing about these periods is like, they're up for historians to decide when we officially entered or exited these things. But at the core, one of these elements is, and most people I think are familiar with sort of like the first industrial revolution, right? The information age and these sort of things. But one of the things that has been interesting to talk about in relation to that question, what will it mean to be human in the future, is picking up on some of these aspects of this time period of fourth industrial revolution. Right. Again, excuse that term, but referencing this time where we're basically starting it now, who knows how long it will go, but with this idea that the advancements, innovations, disruptions between physical, digital, and biological technologies happen at such a speed or velocity and then have massive implications to which the human experience to date has never felt that speed before.
I think that's it. We're feeling that this distancing between our very biological human experience and what we're capable of with the technologies and the science at our fingertips. And on one hand, that's unbelievably exciting because we're actually getting to the point where we can break away from our biological heritage, our evolutionary heritage. At the same time, we are going into completely uncharted territory, and we're not even sure that we've got the smarts or the tools in order to navigate this.
Yeah, and certainly not it always plays those questions when you have these fundamental technological advances, like, this idea of, are we just playing God? Do we, what do you get, right? When
it's something that seems to be brought up every time. We create a new technology and somebody says, are we playing God?
Yeah. But there is that question too of, I think as humans, we go back and forth, we swing a pendulum in many ways of moving things to a point and then learning the hard way in some cases, what happens when you don't do it with care or you just use these things. These could be technologies used as weapons or things that could become just even, here's another term that you'll hear endlessly, I think, out of my mouth is unintended consequences.
Right, yes.
Meaning these things that we didn't understand fully or appreciate fully, what the first, second, third, fourth, and so on, orders of magnitude of change or...
And yet here's also part of the challenge that people talk a lot about. We cannot afford paralysis by analysis.
Yeah.
We cannot afford to stand here as humanity and say, because we don't know what the unintended consequences are going to be, we're just not going to do anything. Because even doing nothing in a dynamic world has consequences.
It's doing something.
It's doing something.
Intentionally doing nothing. So I think that brings me to a question around this role of, so today, right? So again, if we're using this framing question of what is it going to mean to be human in the future, how do we start thinking about the role or how we approach emerging technologies? We can use AI as an example, or any of the other, new bio. If you're taking a new prescription drug, or if my kids just yesterday got their COVID vaccines, right? I'm still going to wait for mine for another 2 weeks, I think. But it's the same thing, right? Using these medicines that are using advanced technologies to make them, readily available, whatever. How do we start thinking about the role? You see, also 4 years ago, you wouldn't just say, "Oh, whatever," about our, mRNA vaccine. But the point I'm taking the long way around to get to, the question that won't leave my mouth, is essentially, how do we handle or approach these emerging technologies, thinking about the role, like how do we interact with them today, thinking about what that might mean for us?
Yeah.
Right? We don't want to rush. We don't want to take too long of a time.
Right.
So how do we thread that needle of...
So I think part of the answer is there are no simple answers here. And I feel bad saying that. As an expert in this field, I feel as if I should have answers. But the more I learn, the more I realize there are no easy pathways forward. Right. But I think there are some things that we really need to think carefully about here. One is this idea that, so I'm sure a lot of people would disagree with this. I think technology innovation is inevitable, or innovation generally is inevitable. It's just part of our genetic heritage.
Yeah.
It's what we do as humans.
Yeah.
We see a problem, we use our brains to work out how to solve it, and that leads to innovation. So you can't stop innovation. The only way to stop innovation is to stop being human, which actually brings us back to what it means to be human. So that means when you get to advanced technologies, you can't say, let's decide whether to go forward or not. All you can say is, how do we steer this innovation into a direction which is going to be better for humanity rather than worse? That is a really important framing, because it means that now we can begin to ask about what we see emerging. How can we ensure it gets us to a point as humanity where we are in a better place? And that fundamentally comes down to what is it we value as humans? What makes us human? And how can we use these technologies to enhance what makes us human? So that, to me, is a really important starting point. Of course, then all the really difficult heavy lifting is how you actually do that in a really, really complex society. But not only that, as a society where there are so many constraints on what we can do, that it makes that pathway forward incredibly convoluted.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If only a unit like ours would have these guiding principles on how we think about these sort of things.
What a novel idea.
Someone should have written those down. Right. And so I think I want to jump into some of those guiding principles, because I think those also are really good frameworks to try in thinking about, again, because there is a daunting level. And if you do futures work, if you talk to groups or organizations and start talking to them about, even specific things, which we're not going to talk about today, but things like, foresight and all these methodologies and whatnot. One of the biggest challenges is to get people to think about time.
Yes.
And also how to sort of mentally untangle so much of what you just had mentioned, right? This complexity of it. It's not an easy way to move forward with a lot of these things. And each thing can be so nuanced and be, in some ways, either the catalyst or the output of so many chain reactions of things that if this happens, then there's a probability this could happen, and then so on and so on and so on. And there's these orders of change that can sort of unfold. I think also kind of around the same idea was this line. I use it all the time when you're like, what does a futurist do? Or what do
you do, Sean?
What does it's like, well, the first thing you don't do is predict the future. Right. I think at one point I had said I stopped using the line, but I was saying, predicting the future is a role for, like snake oil salesmen and, things like that. But, what you don't do is predict the future, but really that using these tools, using these things, as we've talked about before, how do you using techniques to get where you want or stay away from existential situations.
Right, what you really don't want.
Right.
Yes.
Is you're really preparing for uncertainty and you're learning how to handle uncertainty in a way that doesn't induce panic or any sort of like short-sighted,
Right. I would also add to that agility, that ability to move fast and intentionally when things don't turn out as you expect.
Yep. And that's one of the big sort of strategic skill sets to learn, is how to constantly be evaluating and thinking about these possibilities so that if they do arise, we can rewind the clock to 2019 and all of a sudden there's this noise about this virus that's growing, these global pandemics that for a long time have been in many, many slide decks over these different things to prepare for, massive categories of black swan events and uncertain things. Global pandemics were always one of them. Right.
Yep.
And then we had one.
Yes. And we were blindsided. It's rather shocking. Yes.
I know. But those are one of those opportunities where like those things do happen and you can do lots of case studies on people who have done well or done poorly over these things. But having that agility to have the ability to react to when one of these uncertain elements sort of unfolds. What does that mean? And that could be across sectors, right? We'll talk, you'll hear other terminology later around things like megatrends, but there are these categories. So if some innovation or something happens in, let's say, a geopolitical state or in education or in finance, that these all have, nothing is in isolation. All these things are connected.
Everything is intertwined. Yes.
Yeah.
But actually, and I'm getting back to your original question about how we think about this, that intertwining is just critically important.
Yeah.
You can't isolate things. You can't isolate sectors. You can't isolate trends. You can't isolate what you call an emerging technology versus not an emerging technology. Right. You can't isolate that from social sort of advances and trends. You can't isolate it from the fact that we're living on an enclosed system, in an enclosed system on planet Earth, and we are making a real mess of that, pushing things towards sort of boundaries and tipping points.
Yeah, very true. Very true. So let's talk a little bit about our guiding principles.
Yes.
I have them written down here.
Good, because even though I wrote them, I can't remember them.
I feel like I want to turn this into some kind of weird game show, but I'm not going to do that.
Tell me principle number 3. Yes.
Pop quiz, Andrew. So I'll read them all.
Yep.
And then this will be the game. I'll read them all, and you pick the one you want to talk about first.
Okay.
So our guiding principles. So things like, and again, this is around what is needed to tackle these kind of questions. Like, what does it need? What is it going to be human in the future? Obsessive curiosity. Love that. Radical creativity. Respectful inclusivity. Grounded exuberance. And catalytic serendipity.
Yeah. Let's start
What's
with
your favorite?
Well, actually, they're all my favorite. Let's start with the catalytic serendipity because I'm in love with the concept of serendipity. I have been for most of my professional career. This idea of unexpected surprises that excite and wow you and offer new opportunities. And to me, it's hard to emphasize how important this is, simply because if you're in a world which is changing rapidly, and you have no ability to spark new ideas and new insights, new ways of thinking, how are you going to move forward? And we can talk formally about innovation and invention, but there's got to be some fuel to that. And this idea of having conversations where all of a sudden connections are made that you would never expect, and those sparking ideas in your head, and you going off in a new direction, that to me is unbelievably powerful.
Yeah.
So that's also where the catalyst that comes in. So it's not just sort of the delight of new ideas, but it's how that leads to new actions. But there's one part of that is really important to me and really personal. We have sometimes this attitude that only the educated, only the experts can be part of these conversations.
Right.
And I think it's such a dangerous thing because in my experience, everybody that I meet, everybody that I have conversations with, irrespective of who they are, where they come from, how old they are, what their educational levels are, what their socioeconomic status is, they have the ability to really sort of catalyze and serendipitously stimulate sort of delight and awe and wonder and intrigue in my mind. Yeah. And it's that idea that everybody, when you bring them together with others, has this ability to spark new ideas and new ways of thinking, especially when it comes to the future and what's important to every single one of us. So that's why I love that principle, this idea of being open to those sort of conversations.
Yeah, 100%. And I think that also I think I'll just piggyback on that one to talk about the respectful inclusivity, right? Yes. And that also talks about takes specific aim at some of these broader critiques of traditional futures focused work, or you can extend that to just, higher education or what that far too often it is a global north perspective, right? So it's pushing the values, the perspectives of very influential, powerful, or even dominant viewpoints and cultures and people, but that is no representation of this entirety, right?
Yes.
So really being thoughtful and mindful about this inclusivity of sharing that, especially, I mean, there's, again, you'll hear some of these terms kicked around in different camps of futures work and things like that, of protecting vulnerable populations. And that's a broader sort of sweep, but the intent is still there, which is to make note of the fact that, while the global north might be pushing a lot of the technology and a lot of the things, so where those innovations are coming from, right, that is by no means and it is almost this sort of militant foreclosure of futures when you think about, only the global north perspective, because we're missing the majority of the world's population.
And if you think about this, if we really do not know where the future is going, so there's a huge amount of uncertainty there, how can we be certain in our own perspectives and ideas? And the only way to deal with uncertainty is to have the humility to realize that you don't know everything. You don't have all the right perspectives. Right. And being open to be inspired by other people, no matter where they come from. So when we were writing these, that was inclusivity in the broadest possible sense, realizing that we're all in this together, every single person on this planet, and everybody has something to contribute to how we think about the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So let's talk about a little bit in terms of curiosity. And I'll mix these two, curiosity and creativity.
Yeah. So what was it? Radical curiosity.
Obsessive
curiosity and radical creativity. Yeah. So I've got to be honest here and say this was very, very self-indulgent as well, because there's nothing I like more than being part of a very informal, relaxed group of people and just having the conversation spurred on by curiosity, obsessive curiosity, asking what if this, what if that, what if everything we thought about the world isn't true? What if we're living in a simulation? What if gravity doesn't work the way we think it does? And that to me is, number one, it's intellectually exciting. It's just exciting anyway. So I've got to say something about that, because I know that many people listening, and certainly many of my colleagues, will say, you're just indulging yourself, sort of having interesting, exciting conversations. No value in it at all, other than it sort of making you feel good. I fundamentally disagree.
Same.
Because I think when we have those sort of conversations where, as a human being, we're excited and we're awed and we're filled with wonder and we're filled with possibilities, that's what changes the way we think, the way we see the world, the way we see others, and the ways we act. So this idea about things being driven by curiosity is incredibly important.
It's incredibly important.
And I think it's a lost art. I think people sort of damp it down so much that they don't see those possibilities. But then you get to creativity, which can be interpreted in so many different ways. But the two go together, because if you're just curious and do nothing about it, where does that lead you?
Yeah, where do you?
But if you use that to stimulate sort of very different ways of thinking and building stuff and doing stuff, that becomes powerful. And again, with creativity, you can talk about sort of intentional creativity, but even just play, even just randomly trying different things, quite often leads to profound insights.
Yep. And back to those serendipitous moments.
That's exactly it.
You have to set yourself up for, and I think one of the pieces to this idea of curiosity resonates very deeply with me as well. Same thing. Those kind of those questions are so fun to grapple with. Right. I mean, even you start to get in these, and you've been subject to these sort of philosophical wanderings that I get into as well. But I mean, things like even taking something like Theseus's ship. Right? Yes. Asking these questions. If you replace the joke was, this is my car. I've replaced so many parts on my car. The question is it
still your car? Is it
still the same car I bought?
And the answer is no, it's your wife's.
We won't go into how much things I think are mine that are not mine. So that kind of comes back to this idea as well of thinking about, so in the last couple of years, I've come to this discovery as well around we can categorize curiosity into two buckets. So we take the broadest cleaver and just you fall in one group or the other.
Okay.
And that was this idea of discovery curiosity versus deprivation curiosity.
Tell me about deprivation curiosity.
So it's not as bad as it sounds.
right. I'm getting worried now.
Yeah, it's kind of one of those fun terms where you put it on a slide or something. People are like, "Oh dear."
Yep.
Well, to put it this way, right? That I just lost all my entire train of thought. Deprivation curiosity. There we go.
You're being deprived of something here.
Geez, my goodness.
It's working.
What happened? Where am I?
Right.
So deprivation curiosity is this idea which has been growing with a lot of the fuels of fear around things like artificial intelligence. So ChatGPT comes out, everyone, homework is over, school is finished, no one's going to do. But this idea of deprivation curiosity is that you really are filling the gaps of knowledge without actually the care or intent of discovering what is truly going on.
Okay.
Right. So I'm a victim of this every time. And as imagine most are.
So this is actually a bad thing then.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, it depends on the context, right? So I want to know how to get from here to some store we're going to. I just enter that in. I don't need to know. I don't need to discover the journey. Just tell me where to go.
Yep.
And so the idea is that you have some lack of information or knowledge and you just get the answer. Right. So it's the shortcut. And there are times, right? It's all context situated where there are times where there's nothing wrong with deprivation curiosity.
Right.
Like, is it on or off? I just need to know. But then this idea of discovery curiosity, right? That is aligned with this obsessive curiosity, where that is this mastery, where you are driven to not only know whether or not why the sky is blue, but to understand all of the elements around it.
So it's generative. You're really sort of extending your knowledge, your understanding, your perspectives. Yes,
that's it. Yep. You're expanding these ideas but then being open to where that journey takes you, because often that is one question when you're again through that sort of discovery method is you might find the answer, but along with that answer are, unlimited potentially number of new questions.
But this is where I think you've also got to be open to possibilities.
Yes.
So if you go into any situation where curiosity is at the heart of it, and you decide you're going to filter out what you like and what you don't like, you've got a problem, because then you're only collecting the things which align with your particular ideology or sort of perspective. But having that ability to change and be excited about change and following new directions, that is really powerful. It's also, it makes you really vulnerable if you feel that something that you hold to be dear to you is being challenged.
Yep, absolutely. And all too often we, unfortunately, you enter in sort of like the cognitive dissonance with that, and then you're like, no, we'll just double down. Well, because if what I believe is wrong, then what does that say about me? See, and I won't let that happen.
This to me feels like the anti-curiosity, where you decide internally what the world is like, and you only accept anything which aligns with your own internal worldview.
Yeah. So the answer to that is no, don't do that.
right. And I've got to add to this. So this is a little trite, but one of the things that gets me most excited when I'm teaching class, and sort of many of the classes I teach, they're discussion classes, it's when a student comes up with a perspective or an insight that I had never thought of before and totally takes me by surprise. And that is such a wonderful point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can round off our principles here with the same idea of the grounded exuberance.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
That like this idea of freely and joyfully exploring the fantastical, but knowing, right, there are limits, there are boundaries in places, but how to navigate those in a context or a setting, class or wherever, podcast.
So the exuberance, it's so important to me, and it actually gets this idea of awe and wonder as well. And it's not losing sight of the fact that we as individuals are amazing, incredible, unbelievable. We're living on a world which is equally just awe-inspiring within a community, which is just amazing. And we're discovering things that just blow your mind. I mean, it is I can't even express, other than that exuberance, just how incredible the world is and the futures that we're developing. I seriously believe we cannot afford to let go of that. Of course, there are incredibly serious things that we have to navigate through, but we can't divorce the seriousness from the exuberance that we have in terms of who we are and what we can achieve.
Yeah, no, it's incredibly. I mean, that's a piece that I'm often reminded is just the how beautiful the complexity of everything is, but yet also how fragile.
Yep.
You know.
And who was it? I can't remember whether it was you or somebody else. I was having this conversation
If it was good, it was me.
Right.
I'm just putting that out there.
Somebody sort of pointing out that we are this incredible thing where we are this super intelligent machine that you fuel with ham sandwiches. Yeah. I mean, how crazy is that?
Yeah.
Or whatever you want to put in place of the ham sandwich.
You are what you eat, right?
Right,
so
right.
Choose good calories.
Right.
No, it's incredible. And I think one fact, I feel like I've heard this many times. But I always kind of come back to it. And it's one of those, I use it with my kids sometimes when I'm like, when you need a perspective too of how some of that awe of the complexity, but also that fragility is the comparison of, so if we think of planet Earth and we think of our atmosphere, and this atmosphere is what sustains, there's more than the atmosphere, but we wouldn't be here without it, right? I mean, from all of what it does in terms of giving us the air that we breathe to protecting us, but it is incredibly fragile, and that it is likened to the thickness. So the atmosphere's thickness to the Earth can be likened to the skin of an apple.
Right.
And when you think about that, it really puts into perspective how fragile that really is as we're on this rock spinning around.
And that gets to the seriousness.
Yeah.
Right? So, and the two go together. You can be delighted and wowed and exuberant and yet take things incredibly seriously. But there's another aspect of this that I didn't want to lose, and that's the grounded bit.
Yeah.
So I think there's incredible power in being super imaginative and speculative, but at the same time, you can never afford to forget the difference between fantasy and reality.
Yes.
So for instance,
that's important.
We could have a great conversation with me seriously believing that you're a hologram in front of me. I would say, I don't believe you exist. And that could be very generative. But at the same time, if I start making decisions after this as if you didn't exist, that is a problem.
That is a problem.
Well,
I've got bills. I've got bills to pay.
Right.
I think that's incredibly important because there is a danger there, right, of believing or being able to sort of offload something from existing or less than existing but mattering.
Yes.
Like it doesn't matter. Or, but I think there's also kind of dovetailed into all of this, right? Is that as we again come back to this question of what does it mean to be human in the future, there's also a level of sort of responsibility in a way
very much so.
Of being participant, being engaged. And again, what does that look like? And the level, I think, is individual as everyone may be.
Right, yes. And it comes back to this idea of diversity. You've got to have a diversity of ideas and thought and aspirations and everything. Right.
But one thing that I want to just mention, because I was delighted to discover this as well. So it was a rediscovery. Long story short, doing some other work, putting things together around sort of the history of future studies and things like that for another component. But I was brought back. And so one of the things that's really sort of fascinating about the academic discipline of future studies, which really, formally it's only been around since the 1960s. So in terms of these, academic disciplines, it's very young still. But some of the origins of it might surprise people to learn that it was science fiction author H.G. Wells.
Interesting.
So, War of the Worlds, H.G. Wells, Time Machine, H.G. Wells, was actually very influential in sort of starting this concept of that we need to have a science of thinking about the future.
Yes.
Which is really sort of fascinating. And one of the things that I think that was really interesting, so this particular piece that he wrote, which is called The Discovery of the Future, so very aptly named, was originally given as a lecture in 1902.
Okay.
And then formally put into print in 1913. But really he goes in, he kind of outlines this challenge that the people, we as a global society, were facing, essentially saying, sort of drawing that there's two types of minds. A retrospective, which he uses the term legal and submissive, which I feel feels really like if you feel seen by one of these, it might not feel good.
So I can go around pointing to people saying, you're a retrospective.
Yeah, or worse, you have a legal mindset,
right.
which I don't think...
You just lost half of our listeners, you realize.
I suppose if I accuse somebody of a legal mindset, they'd be like, yes, I do fancy myself a lawyer.
Right.
But so this idea of a retrospective mindset is one that looks to the past to essentially make decisions.
Right.
That it's usually driven by what's been in the emphasis of tradition, of continual.
Sure, and to be fair, this is where we are. This is how many decisions are being made. Entirely respectable. Certainly, sort of, if you look at the last 100 years, this is how the world seems to have operated a lot of the time.
Yeah, and I think where you get a lot of these common phrases that we kick around, the history is doomed to repeat itself.
Right.
And then so the other type that he proposes that is called a perspective mind. This idea of, or he uses the terms creative and masterful. So if
you can see where his biases are.
If you wondered what H.G. Wells thought about those types, you can tell by his language. He holds no punches in this, and it's a good read. Yep. And we'll put the link in the show notes so people can jump right to it because it's in public domain also. But and of course, as that you might expect with that the difference being that this is a forward-looking mind, sort of constantly looking at the future in terms of using the present. So also making this contradiction of the retrospective mind using today's present, guided by the past to determine the future.
Yep.
The perspective mind is sort of the opposite of using today, but using sort of this, what we call now in today's sort of futures language is backcasting, but thinking, well, what do we want our future to be? And let's just use that historical perspective upside down.
Right.
So how do we get where we want to go? Using today, the present as a stepping stone to where we want to go, as opposed to this idea. But 1902.
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
Sort of calling that out.
Yeah. So actually what I love about this, and I haven't read the piece yet, is this is one of the things I talk about a lot in my work. This idea that we're at a technological tipping point in society where everything we've learned over the last 50 to 100 years in terms of navigating the future doesn't actually work. The rules have changed. Yes, you can learn from the past, but you've got to create that mindset of thinking, how do we do things differently in order to navigate the futures that are evolving? And it's fascinating to hear that clearly H.G. Wells thought that they were at a similar tipping point 100 years ago.
Yeah, yep. A different turn of century.
Right, yes.
Right?
Yes.
And again, if you think about the Industrial Revolution and where those things are happening, I mean, you have this, massive shift in the way things are connected. But I mean, this piece is good, and I'll share it with you as well to give a quick read through, because it is fascinating how many of these points are so topical and salient today.
Yes.
I mean, he calls things out. I mean, foresight as this form of knowledge. So really, again, thinking about the future and making this idea of causation. If this happens, what could happen? And being prepared for all kinds of outcomes and not being, well, we did it this way, so we must continue to do it that way, right? Sort of this claim that you can't predict the future.
Right.
That was, and people I think turned to science fiction writers as you must have some knowledge or you this vision of the future. And, that's not necessarily the case, but, calling out ethics. But I think this one particularly, there's two pieces here that I think are really worth noting. One, this shifting values from the past to the future. So really, again, critiquing heavily society's attachment to the past.
Right.
And really sort of like you can honor those traditions, but to be successful, to be a future focused society, it will be more dynamic and constantly evolving. So you can't, just as we say, you can't rely on those old things because today is different. But this idea of also the role, or I guess the end of the role of exceptional individuals.
Interesting.
Yeah. So
that's something that I think we're going to cover in later episodes, because I think the water is murkier there than some people might think.
Yeah. And his sort of point there is this idea of great, because remember, this is 1902.
Yes.
So he's using the example of individuals like Napoleon and
right,
Caesar.
okay.
But this idea of that questioning that and I think today where we can take it is all this, this the strong man idea, or this the one person is going to shape these, but really saying that it's not so much about that one person changing, but more of a societal and cultural driver of these things.
Which is actually really important. And it ties in with so much work that came after H.G. Wells in terms of trying to understand the nature of innovation and change within society.
Yeah. And then I think this big piece I thought was really amazing was this concept that humanity is not the final product.
What is?
Yeah. Well, this concept that humanity is not the final product, that he's essentially suggesting that humanity evolved from simpler forms, that there may be a future developments of beings that surpass us in ability, intellect, and purpose.
So I love that. And you can see exactly where he's coming from, sort of on the heels of Darwin and those early explorations of evolution. But of course, you reframe it in today, and now we're talking about artificial intelligences.
Artificial intelligence, or even, the way I was interpreting it as well, is that 1902 humanity is not the finished product. In 1902, we did not have the types of sort of transhumanism or even just biohacking, right?
Yes.
Even medicine, right?
Right.
It is incredible. So I think if you read that thinking space aliens, I think that's a different story. But I think if you think about it in the sense that the present humanity of today is not the finished version of us, right? That we still have so much more to go. It's incredible stuff. So well over 100 years ago.
That's pretty amazing. Yes. Yeah.
And still, if you took change some references or run it through ChatGPT and say like, remove all the old timey language.
It looks modern.
Yeah.
Very interesting.
You could reskin this thing as
So in other words, if H.G. Wells was around today, he, I'm sure, will be a proponent of what we're doing through the future of being human. And he would almost definitely be part of these communities where we're having these serendipitous conversations.
Absolutely.
Driven by curiosity.
I think he would definitely be a subscriber to Modem Futura.
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
And you should be too. Well, if you're listening to this, maybe you already are. So we appreciate that. But so I don't know. I think we should probably call it. I think that's a good place to dismount.
I think, that was a really interesting, meandering conversation, but touched on so many really intriguing and critical things. And I think even the conversation encapsulates what we are doing here.
Absolutely. That this will be a fun ride. And so I think so from myself, from Sean and from
me, Andrew,
we thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you on the next episode of Modem Futura.
We'll see you there.
Demodulating signal.
Modem Futura is a production of the Future of Being Human initiative at Arizona State University. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. To learn more about the Future of Being Human initiative and all of our other projects, please visit us on the web at futureofbeinghuman.asu.edu.
End transmission.